For 6 years, Anthony Fauci was the face of America's COVID response. For most of those years, he repeatedly argued that the virus had almost certainly come from nature, while the laboratory hypothesis was publicly dismissed as a conspiracy theory. Yet over 6 years after the pandemic that cost 15 million lives worldwide, the natural origin of the virus had never been found, and the contrary conclusion he dismissed has become more convincing. Last week, the story entered a new chapter. Appearing before the Senate Homeland Security Committee, Fauci invoked the Fifth Amendment 111 times. He answered no question from any senator across 3 hours. He was there because of a document release. In late July, Senator Rand Paul published thousands of pages of Fauci's diaries and emails recovered from a government computer. They gave us an unprecedented look into what happened behind closed doors. So I started reading. The deeper I dug into those files, the more they reminded me of a story I've been following for 6 years. A story that barely reached Western audiences. As someone who left China for the UK just days before the pandemic, I've since spent years following the debates in both the English-speaking and the Mandarin-speaking worlds. They often seem like two completely different histories of the same event. One of those histories centered on a Chinese virologist called Dr. li-meng. She says she uncovered insiders' evidence about the virus even before the outbreak was officially announced. She fled Hong Kong in 2020, became one of the pandemic's most contested whistleblowers, and was widely dismissed. For years, Washington's version and the Mandarin language version barely touched. Today, they overlap. This is a story of how two timelines of the same pandemic unfolded in parallel, how newly released evidence shows they finally met, and what questions still remain. The Fauci files are, for the most part, extremely boring, but buried inside them is something I was not expecting. While the public was being reassured that COVID had most likely emerged naturally in the Wuhan wet market, some of the world's leading virologists had been privately discussing a very different possibility since the very beginning of the pandemic. According to the released records, on 31st January 2020, Anthony Fauci held a secret meeting with 12 top virologists to examine the genetic sequence of the virus. 10 of them expressed concerns that the virus contained highly unusual features, suggesting it was a laboratory product. One technical term appears again and again in those discussions: the insertion of furin cleavage sites. Remember it, it turns out to be the most important clue in this entire story. Another detail stood out. By that point, Fauci already knew his agency had funded coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, channeled through EcoHealth Alliance since 2014. If the COVID virus SARS-CoV-2 had come out of research connected to that laboratory, the man leading America's response had a profound conflict of interest at the center of it. The files make clear that everyone in the meeting in January understood the stakes, but still privately questioned the real origin of the virus. While Fauci's advisors were discussing the lab leak in Washington, another investigation had been running for a month, 8,000 miles away. Its investigator was Dr. li-meng, then a researcher at the WHO Reference Laboratory at the University of Hong Kong, one of the region's leading infectious disease labs, and one of the few channels through which information about the highly concealed mainland outbreak could still be shared. In her account, her supervisors asked her twice, on the 31st of December 2019 and again on the 16th of January, to secretly investigate the outbreak in Wuhan in order to report to the World Health Organization. Unlike other researchers, Yan has spent years building professional relationships with top scientists and clinicians across mainland China. So instead of relying solely on official announcements, she began gathering information directly from inside the medical system there. Within weeks, she had reached 3 conclusions. The virus was spreading efficiently between humans. The official case numbers were far below reality. And the seafood market was an unlikely source because in her reading, the virus carried engineered characteristics that pointed towards a Wuhan lab. She says that when she reported this, her supervisors declined to pass it to the WHO and told her to stay silent, warning her she would otherwise be disappeared. Then she made a decision that would change her life. On the 19th of January 2020, she anonymously sent what she had gathered to Lude Media, a Chinese-language YouTube channel covering mainland current affairs. The channel had built a niche but devoted audience by publishing leaks from anonymous officials, professionals, and business leaders across China. That night, Luda Media went live. The anonymous whistleblower described a rapidly spreading virus, challenged Beijing's public narrative, and argued that the outbreak was far more serious because of the virus's potentially engineered characteristics. The genetic sequence of the virus, she alleged, belonged to the Chinese military. The channel went viral overnight. When I first heard that jaw dropping broadcast in early 2020, I had no way of knowing whether any of it was true. I only knew that almost nobody in the English-speaking world had heard what millions of Mandarin speakers had already watched. Then the timeline becomes difficult to ignore. The next day, the 20th of January, Beijing abruptly acknowledged sustained human-to-human transmission after weeks of denial and after detaining doctors accused of spreading rumors. Central government control jumped from the lowest level to Class A overnight, which led to the Wuhan lockdown 3 days later. That same day, the Wuhan Institute's director Shi Zhengli submitted the sequence that would later become the foundation of the natural origin case, RATG13, identified as the closest known relative of SARS-CoV-2. But it exists only as a genetic sequence, since no live virus was ever recovered from nature. Whether these events were connected cannot be verified. But the released files now let us place this Chinese timeline against the private conversations happening in Washington. Two stories that looked separate begin to look like one. By the 31st of January 2020, Fauci and several of America's leading virologists had seen RATG13 and were still privately entertaining a laboratory origin. Over the following weeks, however, the tone changed completely. Several of those scientists began drafting what became the most influential paper of the pandemic, the Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2. It concluded that the evidence was most consistent with natural origin and that laboratory creation was unsupported. Its influence spread fast. Governments cited it, journalists relied on it, social media companies pointed to it when censoring posts. Within months, the laboratory hypothesis had moved from open scientific question to conspiracy theory. Yet the Fauci files revealed something the public could not see at the time. Before that paper was written, many of its authors privately held considerable uncertainty about its conclusions. Then, according to the records of the secret meeting Fauci held on the 1st of February, he prompted scientists to draft the paper on the basis of the RATG13 hypothesis provided by the Wuhan experts, explicitly to disprove the lab origin theory. He also provided a $9 million bribe to the scientists who authored the paper. To hide his tracks, the day after the meeting, Fauci emailed the NIH director with an instruction: please delete this email after you read it. In April, his former senior advisor David Morens was indicted on federal charges of deleting federal records throughout the pandemic. So the question is why? Why did the laboratory origin question become so frightening that it had to be suppressed? The answer sits several years before the pandemic. In 2014, Fauci's agency NIAID began funding coronavirus research through EcoHealth Alliance in collaboration with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. By the way, Fauci's pardon by Biden dates back to that same year, 2014. Is that a coincidence? I don't know. At the time, this was not unusual. After SARS emerged in my home country in 2003, laboratories worldwide wanted to find dangerous bat coronaviruses before the next outbreak arrived. The Wuhan Institute under Shi Zhengli had become one of the leading centers for that work. 4 years later, something suspicious entered the story. According to federal records released in recent years, in 2018, EcoHealth Alliance submitted a research proposal to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Its purpose was to study how bat coronaviruses might become more efficient at infecting humans. One proposed technique caught my attention: the insertion of furin cleavage sites, the same term from the January 2020 meetings. A furin cleavage site is a short genetic sequence in the spike protein that makes it substantially easier for a virus to enter human cells. In nature, such features can evolve. In a laboratory, they can be inserted deliberately, which leaves a noticeable mark. That is why the term kept appearing in Fauci's private discussions. According to his advisors, SARS-CoV-2 has that artificial mark. DARPA rejected the proposal on the grounds that it was a gain-of-function experiment with no adequate risk assessment of that specific technique. Officially, the experiments were never funded later. But whether that technique was somehow transferred to Wuhan remains unknown. For Fauci, the stakes were therefore far larger than the origin of one virus. They were about whether the worst pandemic in a century would expose the dangerous research system his agency had helped support financially and technically. That's arguably why he wanted to bury the lab origin theory. Only today can we see that there was a mass cover-up. And the damage it caused was huge. The latest congressional hearing also revealed that the suppression of information about the virus's real nature severely hindered the world's ability to treat the disease efficiently and to manage vaccines. And finally, all these findings start to vindicate what the Chinese whistleblower said from the beginning. Here's how the two timelines met. By mid-2020, the two stories were still developing in parallel. In the West, the argument was about the suppression of the lab origin hypothesis. In the Mandarin-speaking world, attention had moved to the fate of the anonymous whistleblower. As Beijing tightened its control following the 2019 Hong Kong protests, joined by millions of citizens demanding political freedoms, the street marches faded under the pandemic, and many organizers were arrested. By April 2020, the chilling effect culminated in the arrest of the iconic media tycoon Jimmy Lai. Against that backdrop, Dr. Li-meng decided she could no longer stay. In April, fearing retaliation for her whistleblowing, she fled Hong Kong for the United States. After arriving, she was interviewed by the FBI and began publicly identifying herself as the anonymous scientist behind the January disclosures. In September 2020, she published a scientific report arguing that SARS-CoV-2 showed evidence of laboratory engineering and that the RATG13 sequence underpinning the natural origin case had been fabricated. The response was immediate. Although no one in the niche coronavirus research community questioned her findings, she was chastised on a variety of grounds by some scientists and the mainstream media in a heavily manipulated public space led by Fauci. She was also overshadowed by controversies surrounding the political figures with whom she later severed ties. The debate increasingly became about Dr. Yan herself rather than the claims she was making. For years, that was where the story appeared to end. But while public attention moved on, official investigations have today quietly vindicated what she said. Ironically, one of those vindications came from an American scientist who had worked closely with the Wuhan Institute of Virology under Fauci's funding. During congressional testimony in 2026, Ralph Barrick, one of the world's leading coronavirus researchers, was questioned about the RATG13 data provided by Wuhan, which in theory could exist in nature and evolve into SARS-CoV-2. However, according to the testimony, even after years of attempting to reconstruct the virus, his team could only produce a heavily debilitated version. This almost proved Dr. Yan's claim that Wuhan's data released following her whistleblowing was fabricated. Dr. Yan's second core pillar was that the virus's data suggested ties to the Chinese military, the PLA, and that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was also used by the military. Now declassified intelligence describes secret work conducted at the institute on behalf of the PLA. An April 2020 NIAID document presented to Fauci even listed PLA officer Zhou Yusen among collaborators on grants funded by American taxpayers. Zhou died under highly suspicious circumstances in May 2020, shortly after submitting a critical COVID research paper and filing a vaccine patent. US investigators strongly suspect he was silenced by the government to cover up his role in the laboratory origins of the pandemic. 6 years ago, I was sitting in a music college dormitory in London, having left China days before the pandemic started. I remember how strange it felt to watch two conversations happen at once. In English, one version of the talking points was everywhere. In Chinese, whistleblowers taking enormous risks simply for speaking were spreading rapidly, yet remained almost invisible to the West. For a long time, those two worlds barely spoke to each other. That's why I wanted to make these videos. I want to place those two timelines side by side and let you see how they developed. The free expression and fierce debate in the West eventually allowed us to revisit a forgotten timeline that was buried initially. It is entirely up to you to decide whether this changes your conclusions. What matters is that we never abandon our belief in the power of truth. If this video helped you see the timeline from a different perspective, I'd be grateful if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.